Well, it officially happened. JD Martinez has fallen into the Mets' laps. We'll break it all down on today's show.
You are Locked On. You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. Want to find any of my work? Follow me on X at Finkelstein Ryan. You can also find some of my writing at justbaseball.com, where I work as the managing editor. Well, it was, I want to say, early February. I did a podcast titled How JD Martinez Could Fall into the Mets' Laps. And here we are. It has happened exactly how I broke it down on that show. I went through all 30 teams. And what I was discussing is how JD Martinez just might not have much of a market. The three teams I thought it would come down to, at the time, the Jorge Soler-less Giants, the Mets, and the Angels. The Giants end up adding Soler. They apparently offered JD Martinez a 1-year, $14 million deal. He declines because, according to John Heyman, didn't want to play in that spacious ballpark. He sits on the market. He waits. He waits. He waits. Here we are, the last week of spring training. And if it really was Mets or Angels, I guess it seems a lot more attractive to go play in New York with Pete Alonso, Francisco Lindor, Brandon Nimmo, Jeff McNeil, and have a shot than going to play with the Angels where it's Mike Trout and who else. So here he is. He comes to the Mets. And on a 1-year, $12 million deal. For anyone who's had any complaints about David Stearns throughout this offseason, I think you are starting to see what he can do, not only with Steve Cohen's resources, but just how he can play the market. Because if Billy Upler was the Mets GM, they probably would have signed JD Martinez 2 months ago to a 2-year, $40 million deal. And at the time, fans would have loved it because, hey, JD Martinez was on the Mets. But if this year JD Martinez has a back injury that flares up and he's not in the lineup for a large portion of the season, Mark Vientos ends up getting a shot and ends up being great, and all of a sudden you're on the hook for JD Martinez next year, you'd be really regretting that contract. The Mets stuck to their guns this entire time, and as I've said on countless shows, I mean, it was like I was beating a dead horse. I was constantly talking about JD Martinez, but the thing that I always said is it has to be a 1-year deal. Has to. You don't want to be tied to him for a second year. And originally when I did that show, breaking down all 30 teams and why he wouldn't fit in place X, Y, and Z, the contract that I came up with at the time, again, this was when opening day wasn't right upon us, I thought he'd get like a 2-year, $36 million deal where the second year wasn't guaranteed. So he'd get $18 million with some type of a mutual option with a buyout attached. I mean, I thought he was going to get way more money. $12 million. The Mets get him on a steal. And now you look at their lineup, it is so much deeper. We'll talk about Mark Vientos and what this means for him a little bit later on the show because this is a big blow to him in his development. I get that. But Mark Vientos hasn't showed us enough during his time in the big leagues and even in spring training to warrant not pulling the trigger on a guy that is perennially a candidate to drive in 100. And a guy that will give Pete Alonso in his contract year more protection than he's ever seen in his career. And with that protection, Pete Alonso has still been the best run producer in baseball. So now what can you do when pitchers actually fear the guy that's sitting on the on-deck circle when he's in the box? Last year, JD Martinez hit .271, had a .321 on base, and a .572 slug. He drove in 103 runs. He had 33 home runs, 27 doubles, 2 triples, 62 extra base hits, and all of that in 113 games played. Weighted runs created plus is a stat that measures hitters on a league average of 100. Last year, JD Martinez's WRC plus was 135. I would have to go back and look at all the Mets numbers, but I think the only guy who might have been close to that is Brandon Nimmo. I believe everybody else was below 130, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, I think DJ Stewart had like a 133 WRC plus, but it was 58 games. Okay, so it's not a full season. The bottom line, JD Martinez makes this team significantly better this season. And any questions about Vientos, Yeah, that's something that is pressing to the future. But when you're talking about a guy that doesn't have a position anyway, it's not someone that you have to be so shy about blocking his development when you can add a bat that slots into the middle of your order and makes you that much better. You look at this lineup now. Brandon Nimmo, Francisco Lindor, Pete Alonso, JD Martinez, Jeff McNeil, Francisco Alvarez, Starling Marte, Brett Beatty. That's your top 8. And Beatty, mind you, starting to turn around this spring. He's having a nice camp now since the calendar turned to March. He hit another home run today. So Beatty looks pretty good. And then Bader, batting 9th. Your defense is good. And all of a sudden, that lineup really lengthens out. I put that lineup against pretty much anybody in the National League East outside of the Braves. I don't think the Mets are that far off from the Phillies now. I mean, who's batting at the end of that Phillies lineup? Let me pull up roster resource really quick here. I feel like if you're telling me Marte, Alvarez, and Beatty are at the end of this lineup now, it can't be that much worse than whatever the Phillies are putting together. You look at the Phillies right now, roster resource on FanGraphs. You got Schwarber, Turner, Harper, Real Muto. Let's do that game real quick. Who would you rather have? Schwarber, Turner, Harper, Real Muto, or Nimmo, Lindor, Alonso, Martinez? Stott, Bohm, Castellanos. Even put Stott to McNeil. That's an interesting conversation. The bottom 4, Bohm, Castellanos, Marsh, Rojas, compared to Alvarez, Marte, Beatty, Bader. I mean, the Mets just got so much better with this addition. And we can talk about the long-term implications, and we will, but for 2024, for $12 million on a one-year deal, it's a no-brainer to get a guy that consistently hits the ball harder than most hitters in baseball. I mean, go to the Baseball Savant page, you'll see it. It's bright red across the board. He is a professional hitter. He's been doing it year over year, unless there's been the season with maybe a back injury mixed in, like 2022 wasn't the best for him. He only had 16 home runs, but he was dealing with an ailing back all year. But the guy, you look at the RBI numbers. Let's go back to 2017, 104 ribbies. 2018, 130. 2019, 105. 2021, 99. The year with the back injury, 62. And then last year, 103. So he's going to drive in runs. You're going to have 2 bona fide run producers there with Alonso and Martinez. And now I'm really excited to see what this lineup can do. Does this team still have question marks? Absolutely. Is it on paper what they look like going into last year? Definitely not. But put this Mets lineup against the Padres lineup, against the Giants lineup, the Cardinals, the Cubs, all these teams that are in the wild card race. The Mets can now bang with anybody. And that's a really good sign going into the year. They were going to be asking a ton of Beatty and Vientos this season. In some ways, they were going to make or break the season. Now you take pressure off both of them, and really just it allows everybody else to fall into a much more comfortable place. I do want to discuss the Vientos element to this because it's hard to ignore it. So we'll get to that in just a minute. First, though, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tournament. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a 1 seed, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's going to win it all. Also, right now, you can look at MLB season props. So you look at the Mets over/under. I bet it might change. I've been seeing it at 81.5. Maybe it's going to bump up a win or two with JD Martinez entering the fold here, but you can grab that over at FanDuel. Also, Pete Alonso's home runs at 41.5. Before you bet on those season-long futures, though, make sure you place that $5 bet on a tournament game or an NBA game. If you win that $200 in bonus bets, you can get guaranteed. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops till they cut down those nets. So let's discuss Mark Vientos now, okay? Because obviously this hurts for him. He was going into the season as the clear DH. You've been watching this competition in camp with guys like DJ Stewart and G-Man Choi, and there just wasn't a competition. And so I think he was going to get everyday run. And no matter how bad he did early on, I think they would keep putting him in the lineup. But now he's going to take a seat on the back burner a little bit. But I think what this signing does, more than replace Mark Vientos, it's replacing the other guys. It's replacing DJ Stewart and G-Man Choi and those other guys that would have grabbed that last bench spot. If the Mets still roster Vientos, which I think they should, their bench now is Mark Vientos, Joey Wendell, Tyrone Taylor, and Omar Narvaez. I think Wendell and Taylor are obviously there for defense, but Vientos, whenever you need a pinch hitter, he's going to get those opportunities, and I believe they're going to platoon him and Beatty at third. So anytime there's a lefty in the lineup, you're going to see Mark Vientos starting at third base, JD Martinez at DH. Originally, before this signing, I thought we'd see a lot of Starling Marte at DH. So in those instances, you would have seen Marte DHing against lefties, and then they could go with the Bader, Taylor, Nimmo outfield. Now I think in some respects, this cuts into Tyrone Taylor's playing time, maybe even Harrison Bader to some respects, because I think Starling Marte is going to be in right field a little bit more. With that said, you play the hot hand between those two guys. When you look back at 2022, Eduardo Escobar, Daniel Vogelbach, JD Davis, Dom Smith, Darren Ruff, those were the main guys that contributed at third base and DH. Also, Louis Guillorme. Combine all their plate appearances for the Mets, it was 1,493. Did the same thing for last year's group, which was a lot more names, but it was about 1,300 plate appearances. So somewhere between 1,300 and 1,500 plate appearances is how much you could expect from those two spots in your lineup. Let's just say it's 1,400. If Brett Beatty was going to get 500 plate appearances and Mark Vientos was going to get 400 plate appearances, that would have left 500 plate appearances for the Choi, Stewarts, etc. Now those plate appearances get filled by JD Martinez. And I still think Mark Vientos can get 400 plate appearances this season. It's not going to come as consistent early on, but this is a marathon of a season. Anything can happen. Brett Beatty can go down. Pete Alonso can go down. JD Martinez, who played, 113 games last year, he can go down for a stretch. You never know. There will be an opportunity for Mark Vientos at some point this year. Now, there also could be a scenario where the Mets decide it's not worth it to roster Mark Vientos. And I hope this doesn't happen, but let's just say they want more defense, in their lineup come opening day. They want more options. Maybe they do roster Zach Short and Mark Vientos has to start the year in AAA. That would be really rough for him because he has played a ton of AAA baseball and he's definitely worthy of being on an MLB roster. If that happens, though, and the Mets are remarkably healthy this year and he doesn't get his opportunity, it's unfortunate for that one guy, but that would have meant that the team is doing a lot better. And I think long-term, when you're thinking about how Mark Vientos fits into the Mets plans, it was always a little bit of a square peg trying to get fit into a round hole. That was always going to be an issue, trying to figure out what was going to happen there. We still don't know what they're going to do next offseason, whether Pete Alonso comes back, whether they try to get in the mix on Juan Soto, who knows? But, having how old is Vientos? 25, 26? Or he's young, actually. He might be 24 still. Regardless, having a kid penciled in to be the answer at DH for 6-7 years, that's not necessarily the best way to build your team long-term. So, I don't think you need to just clear a spot for him forever at DH. If you had no other better options, obviously see what you have in his bat. But when you have the chance to get a guy who's a perennial all-star that you can plug into the mix, that'll take your team that's probably already about a 500 ball club, who could swing enough games that you actually make a wild card run, it's worth it. It's worth it for a franchise that still wants to win. And now you look at what they have, and with the lineup in place, how it is, with the pitching depth that they have that isn't the best, but there's enough arms that they can stay in games, like this team is starting to make a lot of sense. They got to score runs, they got to play good defense, and their bullpen has to be great. But now that they have JD Martinez, I really think that offense, which is my biggest question mark of those three components, I think that solved a lot here. And so then you'll have to see what this rotation is going to look like and see how bad it could be, because that could still create your season. But if they can be about average and the lineup can consistently get back in some games where maybe, Adrian Hauser gives up 4 runs and 5 innings pitched, but the Mets hang in there, then you can steal those games late. And, I think this team has a chance to really be a contender now. I think they did before this signing too. There's still a lot of things that have to go right in either scenario, but banking on both Beatty and Vientos to put it all together this season, it was definitely a tall ask. Now, let's say Beatty doesn't carry over these spring results, and you start the season and he's in the doldrums again. All right, you could always option him, and if Vientos is playing pretty well, might have his shot. So we'll see how this actually ends up playing out the way it does throughout the season. But if at any point this offseason, I put it to any Mets fan or, any general manager in baseball who had this decision, but you said JD Martinez can be the Mets DH on a 1-year, $12 million deal, who in their right mind ever would have said no to that? So with that in mind, you take him. He fell right into your lap. And now you roll into the season, and all these questions and problems you might have with fitting in all this young talent, they will be solved by the marathon. They just will. So we don't necessarily see the roadmap to 400 plate appearances for Mark Vientos today, but it's going to come at some point. So I am obviously really excited about what this signing means for the Mets here. And it's going to be really fun to watch this lineup day in and day out, really hopefully become kind of feared a little bit. And that's what I want to go through next here. I want to compare the Mets lineup to the others in the National League right now. So we're going to run through a bunch of them and see how this lineup all of a sudden stacks up with Pete Alonso and JD Martinez right in those middle spots, driving in runs. Before we get to that, though, today's episode is brought to you by Amazon Fire TV. Fire TV offers amazing viewing experiences with smart TVs, as well as the Fire TV stick that you can plug into your existing TV that provides access to millions of TV episodes and movies, as well as free and live TV. Whether it's the open weekend of baseball, college basketball tournament, you're going to want to have your Fire TV. Fire TV recently created the Fire TV channels, deliver a constant supply of the latest videos from your favorite sports brands, all for free. That includes all of us at Locked On and most of the big pro leagues and college conferences as well. Fire TV channels let you dive into all the game analysis, highlights, and more, and keep up to date on all the latest in the world of sports, not to mention great news, entertainment, gaming, travel, and cooking videos as well. Check out Fire TV channels on Fire TV and Alexa devices. If you haven't checked out Fire TV channels, you should. To learn more, visit www.amazon.com/LockedOnFireTV. All right, so let's look around the game here and try to compare the Mets lineup to what we see for all these other teams. Obviously, we already did the Phillies there. I think the Mets are comparable, seriously. Obviously, the rotation, not quite up to the level of the Phillies with Nolan Wheeler. But when you really look at the names, Schwarber, Turner, Harper, Realmuto, Stott, it's good. But if Jeff McNeil bounces back, JD Martinez puts up a similar season, Pete Alonso in a contract year, Lindor and Nimmo as consistent as they can be, this top five for the Mets could be really, really good. And with Alvarez's upside, Marte as a positive regression candidate, Beatty having a good spring, I'm suddenly really liking what the Mets can put together. Now, earlier this week, I did a show after the Blake Snell signing, just kind of looking at how the road got tougher in the wild card mix, right? You look at the Padres, and yes, they just hung a ton of runs on the Dodgers today. Yoshinobu Yamamoto, Mets might have dodged a bullet there, huh? I'm sure he'll be fine, but rough first start for him. You look at their lineup. Bogarts, Tatis, Cronenworth, Machado, Hae-Sung Kim. It's good. The back half, Jurickson Profar, Luis Campusano, Tyler Wade, Jackson Merrill. I mean, I think the Mets have a better lineup than the Padres now. And I think it was comparable before you got JD Martinez. Now I think the Mets are clearly better. You look at, the Giants. They had the Jorge Soler edition, the Matt Chapman edition. All right, well, look through it. Jung-Hoo Lee, Tyro Estrada, Lamont Wade, Jorge Soler, Michael Conforto, Matt Chapman, Mike Yastrzemski, Patrick Bailey. Not the best team. I think the Mets have a better lineup there. I'm just looking at teams that are in that wild card mix. The Diamondbacks are good. Okay, they're coming off the World Series appearance. Corbin Carroll, Ketel Marte, Lourdes Gurriel Jr., Christian Walker, Jock Peterson, Gabby Moreno, Eugenio Suarez, Alec Thomas, Geraldo Perdomo. I don't think they're better than the Mets. Really, there's two lineups I see in the National League that are distinctly better than the Mets, and that's, of course, the Braves and the Dodgers. But outside of that, the Mets can compete with anybody offensively. And so if they could put together a season where everything clicks the way it did for them in 2022, all of a sudden, if you have one of the best offenses in baseball, your bullpen's really good. You got Nemo, Bader, Marte, Tyrone Taylor. Those are all good defenders in the outfield. The infield, your only hole defensively might be third base. Alvarez looks like a stud behind the plate now, controlling the running game, unless they have some ridiculous obstruction rule called at second. Don't know if any of you saw that one today. Lindor getting called for obstruction when he barely blocked the bag. That'll be a whole thing to follow throughout the season. But regardless, the Mets check a lot of boxes. And as much as I have never sold my stock in Mark Vientos, and I was banging on the table for him to start over JD Davis in 2022, I've wanted to see him get the opportunity last year. Why are they starting Daniel Vogelbach? I can't believe it that they should be giving Vientos the shot. Well, think about those names I just mentioned. JD Davis, Daniel Vogelbach. A second ago, we were talking about JD Davis coming back to the Mets. And again, I was against it because Vientos should have played over him. None of those guys is JD Martinez. It's a different conversation entirely. So, yeah, it sucks for Mark Vientos today. Absolutely. But if he's really good, he'll find his way to contribute to this team. And now the biggest question mark I think you had about the New York Mets going into the season, which was, what's Vientos going to do and who's going to grab that last bench spot? All right, those questions have been answered. Last bench spot? Well, it's not a bench spot. It's your everyday DH and JD Martinez. Assuming Vientos grabs the actual last bench spot, all right, you lose G-Man Choi. Maybe he signs with another team. Doesn't matter. Now, DJ Stewart sits in Syracuse. That's some outfield depth for you. We'll see if we see him this season. But the Mets have a lineup to be feared now. And I think they had a good lineup before the signing. That's the difference. 1 year, $12 million. David Stearns played it cool the whole time. He said all the right things. Anytime he got in front of the media, he never shut out the idea. He said the Mets are always looking for ways to get better. But he consistently said, we're comfortable with giving our young guys opportunities. We're trying to toe that line between still wanting to be competitive this year and thinking about our future teams. And I think if JD Martinez wanted $1 more than what the Mets set in stone, which I guess was $12 million, they would have been comfortable letting that opportunity pass them by and see what Vientos had. But he falls to you. He wanted to be a Met. Now comes aboard, and this lineup is going to be so much better. So, are anyone else excited for opening day? I think that's where I'm at this point. Since we are live here, fire any questions you got at me. Why would Mark Vientos care? He still cracks the bench, gets paid big league money to sit on the bench. That's from Jason. I think he cares because he wants to play. You know what I mean? But here's another one. Sign Jordan Montgomery. I don't think they're going to sign Jordan Montgomery. And the reason is, they have a lot of pitching depth now. I mean, you saw Christian Scott pitch the other day. That's a guy that has a little bit more of a long-term future. Not that they're not going to sign somebody for him, but more just the fact that they have a lot of good options. They have 5 MLB caliber starting pitchers in their opening day rotation. They have a 6th sitting in Syracuse and Jose Budo. And, coming down the pipeline with, Scott, Mike Vassell, Dom Hamill, David Peterson coming back from injury. And, Kodai Senga, who is now clear to start baseball activities. Another big sign or another big news item today was that, it seemed like the MRI was clean. They're still waiting for him to pass their strength test to really open up his throwing program, but he's cleared for activities now. So, yeah, I think, the Mets are sitting in a good spot, and they don't necessarily need to go out and get Jordan Montgomery. Another question that we kind of addressed is Vientos going to AAA. I don't think so, but I don't know. You really, it's one of those things where I wouldn't be surprised either way. I imagine that keeping his bat is still something they'd like. I also think that shielding Brett Beatty from left-handed pitching is something that could help this year. Just let him focus on hitting righties. And if you do that, you can't have Joey Wendell then start at third base. He's a lefty as well. So that gives Vientos a role, but it is a small role. And you never know. Maybe they decide it's better to let him just mash AAA pitching for the year and, hit 35 home runs in Syracuse, and then he's trade bait at the deadline. There is every chance that they ultimately decide to do that. But I think he's going to make this team. I think so, because I just don't know. Like, what role does G-Man Choi have on this team if they decide to give him the spot? To back up Pete Alonso at first base, that's nice, but I think for the most part, Pete's going to be playing 150 games at least. If JD Martinez is healthy, he's probably getting in there for 140, 150 games if he can actually avoid any back injuries or anything else. So with those guys sort of penciled into the lineup every single day, it kind of mitigates the need for a G-Man Choi or a DJ Stewart anyway. So I guess if Vientos were to end up in AAA, my thought would be it would be for someone like Zach Short, who would give you, another versatile fielder that, has a little bit of outfield experience, primarily infield, but just to mix stuff up there. He also could theoretically platoon with Beatty at third base because he is a right-handed bat. But I think Vientos is going to make this team. I really do. I believe that Martinez simply replaces that spot that would have gone to Choi or Stewart, which is a pretty huge upgrade. Here we go. Rather have Choi than JD. Yeah, for sure. For sure. That's just another comment here. I like this one too. Goodbye, Choi and Voit. That's for sure. I don't think there was any chance that Luke Voit was going to make this team. But if you had to pick, what do you think? Luke Voit or JD Martinez? I think everybody would be on board with that one. So that's going to be all for this edition of Locked On Mets. I have a couple of shows that I'm already working on. We might get a Saturday show or a late Friday release. I already had one that I was about to record on my bold predictions for the Mets this season. Might have to adjust that a little bit with JD Martinez in the fold, but all the research is done there, so I might want to get that one out of the way. Also, top 10 reasons to believe in the Mets this year. Maybe it's the top 11, so that look out for that one. And we'll do a couple more season preview stuff here as we get into opening day. But expect the show for Saturday, as I guess what I'll leave you with. And until then, as always, thank you for listening. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure you follow me on Twitter or X at Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show at Locked On Mets. Also, if you want to be a Locked On Mets insider for the season, you can go to subtext.com/Locked On Mets. That's our texting service. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first watch every day. Now, for your second watch, head over to Locked On Sports Today, the first ever 24/7 channel, streams on YouTube, covering everything in the world of sports with our local experts for each team and our league-wide experts for each league. Find Locked On Sports Today, streaming 24/7 on YouTube.